Live from Singapore, this is Insight with me, Haslinda Amin, where we dive deeper into the stories that matter with crucial context and sharp analysis. U.S. prosecutors charge billionaire Gautam Adani of an alleged $250 million bribery scheme, threatening to throw the Indian tycoon's conglomerate back into turmoil. Units of the Adani Group scrap a $600 million bond sale after the charges, the group's existing U.S. currency notes plunging in Asian trading. Considering the Adani's closeness to the India's Modi government, we'll look at how all this could play out during the Trump presidency. Singapore Management University Nirmalya Kumar will be joining us, along with the Wilson Center's Michael Kugelman. And will this indictment put a dampener on the overall sentiment for Indian equities? We'll put that to Stefanie Holtze-Jen, the Apex CIO at Deutsche Private Bank. Our top story today, a source tells Bloomberg that Adani's renewable units have scrapped a $600 million bond offering after U.S. prosecutors indicted the group's founder Gautam Adani and other executives on bribery charges. The New York-based prosecutors alleged that Adani and other defendants promised to pay more than $250 million in bribes to Indian government officials to win solar energy contracts and concealed the plan as they sought to raise money from U.S. investors. For more, let's bring in our South Asia editor, Anto Anthony in Mumbai. Anto, today, take us through the very latest in this case.
That's right, Haslinda. So, Indian tycoon Gautam Adani's company has scrapped a $600 million bond sale in US after the US attorneys alleged him and his associates of bribing Indian government officials to get solar power contracts. So the US attorneys are alleging that Adani and his associates have promised to pay about $250 million to Indian officials to get these solar power contracts. We have to keep in mind that in this part of the world, Gautam Adani is one of the largest renewable energy power producer, and he's also building one of the largest renewable energy parks in the world, in India. So we have to closely watch how this investigation, how this prosecution will go ahead, and of course it falls upon the Trump administration to decide what further steps has to be taken.
Anto, recently you had an exclusive conversation with Gautam Adani as well as Sagar Adani. You did ask them about the bribery investigations. What did they tell you back then?
That's right, Haslinda, because this is one news that Bloomberg News broke and has covered over the last 1 year, the DOJ investigation into alleged malpractices at the Adani Group. So I asked Sagar Adani, who heads the renewable energy business, about this investigation. Here is what he had to say.
We as a company policy don't typically respond on legal or quasi-legal matters. We made a public statement about this overall anyways, that if there is even an entity that looks at it, it's in due course of their regular business and their regular interactions. So there's nothing specifically in particular that we have to disclose to the market that's separate or in addition from that.
So this is what Sagar Adani told us at that point in July. At that point, the company had also made exchange filings saying that some investigations could be on, but there haven't been, but the US authorities hasn't reached out to them specifically on this. In the following months, we don't know what happened. But right now, when we are talking to brokerages and analysts, what they are saying is that this investigation how this investigation progress will have a material impact on the stock prices of the group company. And we would probably know how it will be going ahead once the Trump administration moves in the White House.
Anto, thank you so much for that. Our South Asia editor, Anto Anthony in Mumbai. Let's stay with this developing story and bring in our guests, both with deep knowledge of India. Michael Kugelman is director of the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute, joining us from Annapolis. And here in the studio with me, Nirmalya Kumar, professor at the Lee Kong Chian Business School at the Singapore Management University. Nirmalya, let's start with you. This is as big as it gets for India. We're talking about the second richest man in the country and a man very close ties with the Modi government.
Yeah, you can't have a bigger story in business India than this. I mean, it is very big. See, the fact that there is some bribing of government officials going on in India is not news, to tell you the truth. What is news in this case is the fact that the amounts involved are staggering by Indian standards, even $250 million plus. And the fact that there was always a suspicion that electricity rates are somewhat rigged, and this seems to indicate that that may be true. But even more importantly, the fact that the US government justice and the SEC is against them, and generally the US government Justice Department does not move unless they have a pretty watertight case. And the fact that they confiscated the electronic devices and downloaded all the messages is a very big red flag, because what people don't understand about WhatsApp is that even messages that have been deleted can be downloaded later by the authorities. So if they have, let's say, a smoking gun here, then it would be very interesting, because this would put lay to rest several of his ambitions. His ambitions after the Hindenburg to clear up the governance, attract better talent. As he's growing very fast, he needs constantly very good talent, especially not only on the managerial level, but also on the boards of directors for governance improvement. That will be, put at a standstill, because no manager wants to put themselves at legal risk vis-a-vis the US government. Secondly, any international, he's already in trouble in Bangladesh, he's already in trouble in Kenya. So his international plans are definitely going to take a hit.
You talked about the Hindenburg report. I mean, draw a comparison for us here. I mean, that led to a spiraling of Adani shares and bonds. Of course, yes. We saw that happening. This is nothing like that Hindenburg report, right? This is way bigger than that Hindenburg report.
Yeah, because the Hindenburg report, people can say, well, that person has an axe to grind because they are trying to be a short seller and benefit from that. And the Hindenburg, in the end, is a private company that is going after you, right? This is much bigger, because this is, of course, people who have the ability to get access to private correspondence, private WhatsApp messages, private PowerPoint presentations, right? It's much bigger than the Hindenburg. Hindenburg was based on their own analysis, which they did. And, you can put a blanket of suspicion on that. But the US government is a different matter. And I think this is going to be major.
Michael, let's bring you into this conversation. You've been tracking developments in South Asia. How are you looking at this? What are the key takeaways for you here?
Well, as noted before, I mean, these allegations are so significant just because of the scale. I mean, $250 million in bribes raised, allegedly. I mean, that's remarkable. And also, again, as was noted before, it's been nearly 2 years that Adani has been trying to fight off these Hindenburg allegations. It's fairly easy for him to deny or shrug off those allegations, because indeed it was an activist short seller that put them out there. And there have also been some other allegations that have been made against Adani and his activities by media organizations over the last year or two. But again, those are easy to deny. But you just can't walk away from something like this when you have an indictment that's unsealed by the U.S. government. It's really significant. The other thing that I would say is that I would argue that the Adani Group and its subsidiaries, their business has actually been booming over the last year. So I would argue that they've actually done a pretty good job of shaking off the Hindenburg allegations. The Adani Group took over a top Indian cement maker last year. Recently, there were $4 billion worth of green hydrogen investments announced by Adani Green. Adani Green has also signed deals with European energy companies. So things have been happening and business activities have been picking up. But now you've got a body blow here to both Adani's reputation and also to his businesses, because it's going to be very difficult to bounce back, at least in the immediate term, from these allegations, which will hurt even more, given that his businesses have been doing fairly well with their recovery over the last nearly 2 years.
We talk about how this is happening on the cusp of a Trump administration. We know that Modi and Trump have had pretty good relations. Might Trump sway this case in any way?
Right. I mean, yeah, that's the big question. We're going to have to see what the next administration does about this. And what we've already seen just over the last few weeks is that Adani has come out and praised and congratulated Trump for his election victory. And he has announced that he's going to invest $10 billion in energy and infrastructure in the U.S. and create jobs. So for Trump, I would think that he's not going to be inclined to be hard on Adani in that, Adani, like Trump, is the businessman. He's praised Trump. He's pledged to invest in the United States in ways that can create jobs. Those are things that I think President-elect Trump would like to hear. So we'll see what actually happens. But I would think that Trump is someone that will not be inclined to do anything that could hurt Adani or make things worse. And of course, the other big story here, what I would argue is really significant, is the relationship between Adani and Prime Minister Modi. I mean, this is not a relationship that either man speaks about publicly, but it's an open secret. We know that there is a partnership and that the Adani Group's portfolio in recent years has really tracked with the policy priorities of Narendra Modi, and that started with infrastructure some time ago, and more recently it's evolved into a lot of focus on green energy. So how India's government responds to these allegations, or if it responds at all, I think that'll be a really notable thing to watch in the coming hours and days.
Nirmalya, we talk about how the Adani Group's fundraising plans, international ambitions will be impacted. Will it impact India Inc.'s expansion overseas? Will it impact India Inc. in any way?
My gut feel is that the India Inc. will still be spared from the fallout of this, because to tell you the truth, it seems to be specific to one group that is heavily involved in infrastructure. Most Indian groups have some involvement in infrastructure, but that's not their entire story. So my hope also is that it's not a big deal. But having said that, the Indian stock market has been on a complete tear over the last few years, and this may give foreign investors who had already pulled out some money over the last 3 months a little bit more pause about investing in India, worried about the corporate governance and the foreign practices of Indian companies, you see. So it's not helpful to Indian business, because it casts a pall of shadow across the entire Indian business and how business is done in India, especially when such a high-profile name. I would say that Adani is about as high-profile a name as you can get in India. And the body blow over here, I would say that to the previous speaker, is not only the obstruction of justice charge is actually quite serious, because, they are claiming or alleging that when they tried to investigate the Adani Group for this bribery, they deleted messages that could have been useful for the investigator. And generally, often it's not what you did that gets you in trouble, it's how you try to cover it up that gets you into more trouble. So I think this is going to be a pretty serious thing. India Inc., even Modi, I think you will find publicly will at least start distancing himself from Adani, because this is so big that I think that they have no choice but to distance themselves from it.
Interesting that you say this is so big, this is as big as it gets, yet the Indian media has been pretty silent about it. How are you reading into that?
This story only broke, let's say, 5-6 hours ago, right? So the Indian media, you're right, up to now, Indian media is very good at protecting their own people, especially the billionaires, because the billionaires generally own partially Indian media, and also they have a lot of control over the media. Having said that, if this story continues to show legs, the Indian media will have no choice but to start putting it on their site. So it may be until now NDTV has not put it on their website, but at some stage they can't not cover it, right? They will cover it. It's not something they're happy to cover, but they will have no choice to cover it. At some stage, also you have to understand today there is two kinds of media. There's the traditional media that will be more, hesitant to cover it, but already Twitter is full of Adani. You look, #1 trending topic in India today on Twitter is Adani.
Michael, you talked about how, it's not in Trump's interest to do anything about this, to sway the conversation or the case for that matter. But when it comes to Trump's cabinet picks, we had a response from Jaishankar, the foreign minister of India, saying that, at this stage, a lot of countries are pretty nervous, but not us. Because he's suggesting that relations between the two are very close. How are you looking at that?
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, the picks that President-elect Trump have made to this point, those that focus on foreign affairs and defense and security, they're known for being particularly strong proponents of partnership with India. I mean, there's a lot of that in Washington. There's bipartisan support for partnership with India, whether commercial or strategic. But these folks, whether you're talking about Mike Waltz or Marco Rubio or Tulsi Gabbard, they are known for being especially large proponents of partnership with India. And I think that that will make it more easy to believe that whatever tensions might creep into the relationship, and I think there will be some tensions that creep into the relationship because of Trump's tariff policies, those tensions will be weathered very successfully just because you're going to have people in this administration that want to make sure that the partnership with India works and succeeds at all costs.
Do you see Prime Minister Modi detaching himself from this case, from Gautam Adani himself, so that he can preserve that relationship with the U.S., you think?
Yeah, I would agree with what Dr. Kumar said. I think that it'll be very difficult for Modi not to distance himself from Adani, and that could mean simply him not saying anything to defend Adani. But we'll see what that actually could entail. But Modi wants the relationship with the United States to work. He knows that he has an important, strong chemistry with Trump. Of course, Adani himself is very critical to Modi, not just because of their friendship, but because of his role in the Indian economy. He's so dominant, as we noted before: energy, infrastructure, media, so much. So I think that it'll be tough for Modi to completely move away from Adani, but I think what he could do to split the difference, so to speak, is simply not be out there publicly defending him. I think that's something that would certainly serve Modi's interests. But both Trump and Adani are important men, important figures when it comes to Modi and his policy priorities.
And the processes are there, right? I mean, there is an extradition treaty, so in effect, the U.S. can take action against Adani.
Right, and that, again, we'll have to see what the Trump administration does. I think it's highly unlikely that would happen. I just don't see the Trump administration going there. But again, there's a lot that we don't know. We've seen the indictment that's been unsealed, but we don't know. We have to see how the legal process plays out and see if things get to a point where there would start to be talk about the possibility of extradition. But I simply don't think that we would get to that point.
And the Foreign Corruption Act is really strong, right?
The Foreign Corruption Act is really strong. It had all the multinationals clean up their act after it was passed, and the reach of that is very strong. You have to remember, Trump controls America, of course, because he's the president. But in America, the system still has some legs beyond just the order of the president as to what to do. And especially the $10 billion investment that Adani was going to make in the US, I think we can put a blanket on that and say that's been put to rest. It's not going to happen. Because, to get investors in America to invest as it is, Adani's shareholding was very restrictive. It was mostly his own companies that were investing in it and some institutions. The retail Indian investor was not very heavily invested in the Adani group. So I think that his ambitions overseas and his ambitions in America are definitely going to take a spanner in the works. There's no doubt about that, And Trump can only do so much because the business community moves based on his self-interest, not based on what the politicians tell them to do, right? So, yeah, for Trump, it may not be a big deal that somebody paid a bribe and got away with it. But for the U.S. investors, especially the heavy institutional investors, for them, corporate governance, bribery, all of these things are strict no-nos in doing any investments.
Nirmalya, is there a right response? How should Gautam Adani respond to this?
I think the best response at the current moment would be to just keep quiet, because I don't think he can make a response which is going to have any credibility at this stage. What can he say except that it's a legal case under legal review? I can't comment on ongoing legal proceedings. Beyond that, what can you say? You can't say anything else, you see. So I think at this stage, that's all he can say. I deny the allegations. It's under legal process, so I'm not at liberty to speak anymore.
How do you see this playing out? What are the next steps we should be looking out for?
I think we should look out next steps to see what does the Justice government do after Trump takes over. Because right now, everything is under slight of a hold until, the change in administration takes place. And after the change in administration, because Trump is appointing very unique people, shall we say, to each of these Justice Department and these enforcement, SEC enforcement and all, whether they will continue to, pursue these cases or not is completely unknown. We don't know enough about the Trump administration to know whether they will continue.
Michael, what's your sense? Will this drag on for some time? How long might this play out for?
Well, I mean, given how serious these allegations are, I mean, this is something that will continue to play out for some time. Can't put a timestamp on it, but I think that there's a process that is going to play out, and I think, as was noted before, it would probably make sense for Adani himself not to say much because there could be more coming. There could be more that gets into the public domain, so to speak, which could make things even worse for Adani, who's already suffered a significant reputational blow. But what I would say here is coming back to the company that was the target of these allegations, Adani Green, which is basically the renewable energy company of the Adani Group. It's a dominant player in what is a fast-growing renewable energy space in India just because Modi has prioritized accelerating India's energy transition. So I think for all those investors that have been involved in renewable energy in India or want to be, I think they're going to be watching very carefully to see how Adani Green is impacted by this, because if it's impacted in a way that affects its business operations, there could be some pretty big openings there for clean energy investors. So I think that's a critical space to watch too. This very important, rapidly growing renewable energy sector in India. See how that's impacted by the fact that one of the giants of that sector, Adani Green, has been hit with these incredibly damaging allegations.
So,
see, while Adani Group has excellent businesses, as has been mentioned by Michael, there's no doubt they have excellent. In fact, they took over ACC and Ambuja Cement recently. I was on the board of both those companies. So they have excellent businesses to run. But there is a Adani discount that will be placed on the stock of all their companies, because this does have an impact on corporate governance, does have an impact on how many investors, foreign investors, would invest in your company. So there will be an Adani discount, regardless of what happens, which this plus the Hindenburg report will put on all Adani stocks across all its group companies. Despite the grand businesses they have, and very well run, by the way. Their businesses are very well run, they're very good businesses, they have very good assets in India, but there will be an Adani discount that will be put on all their companies in the stock market for sure.
thank you so much for your insights today. Michael Kugelman of the Wilson Center and Nirmalya Kumar of the Singapore Management University, of course, commenting on a developing story to do with Gautam Adani. Let's do a check on how GQG shares are doing in Australia. They're slumping on the back of that indictment. Of course, GQG currently trading down by about 20%. GQG saying that it will review the details of those Adani allegations to determine any action to be taken in their respective portfolios. GQG trading down by more than 20% in Australia. Well, still ahead this hour, we'll take a closer look at Nvidia's earnings with Deutsche Bank Private Bank. Hear why the APAC CIO is still constructive on the U.S. tech sector. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Let's take a look at how U.S. futures are shaping up, of course, on the back of news out of Nvidia. Nvidia disappointing with those revenue forecasts and impacting sentiment as a result. Remember, this is one stock that's been lifting sentiment all this time, trading at 30 times forward earnings. S&P futures currently down by 0.2%. Nasdaq futures also in negative territory, along with Dow Jones futures. Nvidia outlook missing the loftiest estimates. Expectations, of course, was sky high, and it failed to meet those estimates. We'll have more on Nvidia just coming up. We're also tracking on Bitcoin, closing in on that 100,000 level. MicroStrategy buying more Bitcoin on the back of what we've seen from that digital asset. Trump weighing on the White House crypto role as well. So all that playing into that crypto space. Bitcoin at 95,087. We have expectations for Bitcoin to get to 100 and beyond. Well, up next, market analysis with Deutsche Bank Private Bank. We'll discuss what Nvidia's latest results could mean for the AI rally. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Asian markets in a pretty subdued mood after Nvidia's outlook missed estimates. Bloomberg's Avril Hong has more on today's action.
Yeah, Has. I mean, the world's most valuable company somehow managing to bring down the mood a little in the region. But to be clear, when you look at consensus estimate, it did beat on top and bottom line. Where it kind of faltered was in missing the mark of the highest estimate for revenue guidance for the current quarter. And I think it speaks to how there was such anticipation and expectation for this high-flying company, and how going into earnings day, price to earnings ratio was something like 50 plus times. You really get the sense that investors were expecting to be rewarded, and instead when the numbers came out, within minutes of it crossing the terminal, we saw Nvidia stock getting punished, slumping 5+%. It paired some of those gains, or losses I should say, eventually, and the stock is still about 3 times where it was since the start of the year. But let's flip the board, because investors also latched onto some other pain points, and this involved its data center side of the business, which accounts for the overwhelming chunk of its revenue. You look at this chart, it shows you how the magnitude of beats has actually been slowing in the past couple of quarters. The other thing that I think investors did not like hearing was how, for the Blackwell chip rollout, it seems to be proving costlier than expected, whether it's production, engineering costs. Jensen Huang, the CEO, did acknowledge some of these supply challenges, but he also seems to suggest that this is to be expected for such a game-changing technology rollout. Have a listen.
It is the case that demand exceeds our supply, and that's expected as we're in the beginnings of this generative AI revolution, as we all know.
Now, in terms of the stock market reaction in this part of the world, of course, we've been keeping a close eye on the chip names. TSMC slumped earlier and is extending these declines from just a day ago, but analysts have already pointed out they don't expect to see massive selling, simply because some of these chip names have already corrected earlier in the year. And as MLive Sebastian Boyd points out on the blog, think of it as an opportunity for some of these Nvidia suppliers. If this company is rolling out new technology, that's going to mean $1 trillion worth of data centers systems globally that need upgrading. So something that could benefit its suppliers as well.
Well, when expectations are so high, it will be difficult to meet those expectations. Avril Hong, thank you. Let's get more analysis on Nvidia's earnings with Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst Robert Lee in Hong Kong. Rob, I mean, you know, there's bound to be disappointment.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, the stock's been trading either at or very close to an all-time high in recent weeks. So, as usual with Nvidia, there's a lot of high expectations built in. I don't think anything they said last night has any great fundamental consequence, and therefore it's unsurprising to get a little bit of profit taking, you know, when expectations are so sky high. I guess if there was any incremental disappointment on the near term, as Avril said a few moments ago, the guidance for the coming quarter didn't quite meet the very highest of expectations out there. But just very briefly taking a step back, I think it's becoming clear that the risk reward for this company and the risk profile is, you know, it's getting harder for them to drive incremental beats. And also there is a greater amount of risk that they have to deal with into next year, particularly the execution risks relating to this new Blackwell chip.
So what could be the catalyst to drive the stock higher? I think trading at about, what, 30 times forward earnings?
Well, I guess a way our American colleagues like to describe it is the traditional beat and raise. And so Nvidia has delivered many quarters of beat and raise, but the level of incremental beats and level of incremental raise is diminishing over time. And as I said, coming back to fundamentals, they've got this industry-leading Blackwell chip. There were some initial production delays over the last couple of quarters, but they seem to have resolved. But this is a highly technologically complex and very large chip. So I think there still is residual execution risk as they ramp up production. And in the near term, actually, whilst the ASP on this big chip is substantial, it will actually depress their margins over the next 2 to 3 quarters. And then once they reach more steady state and into high volume production, we should see that margin come back. So there is some near-term, if I was going to nitpick a little bit, there is some near-term incremental risk there that they need to work their way through.
You're allowed to nitpick there, Rob. We're also keeping an eye on Baidu earnings. Expectations are that they'll disappoint.
Yes, I think, wind the clock back to the beginning of last year. I mean, Baidu was the darling of the Chinese AI sector. It had some market lead and, some early technological breakthroughs. However, what we've seen is, given the low barriers to entry on the technology front, we've seen the big guys come in, the big technology platforms, the Tencents and Alibabas of this world. So their initial leadership is being fast eroded. At the same time, while their core cash-generative advertising or search-driven advertising business is coming under increased competitive pressure, as advertising are preferring to spend their dollars on more contemporary platforms. So particularly short videos. That's what's capturing their ad dollars at the moment to the detriment of the likes of Baidu. So again, just an overriding comment very quickly on Baidu. I think Baidu's biggest challenge is the business is too thinly stretched. It's trying to compete in mainstream AI, it's trying to compete in search, and also it's moving into AVs, or autonomous vehicles. That's too many challenges for a medium-sized company to deal with. And as a result, that's impacting their bottom line at the moment. The revenue growth and monetization isn't coming through. At the same time, they're having to ramp up development costs, and that's depressing their margin. So the market overall, including us, is expecting a relatively lackluster, weak set of results from them later tonight.
All right. Rob, thank you so much for that. Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Analyst Robert Lee there. Well, our next guest remains constructive on the U.S. tech sector with a structural growth theme in AI. Let's bring in Stefanie Holtze-Jen, Apex CIO at Deutsche Bank Private Bank. Good to have you with us. Why constructive?
Because one single earning miss, as you put it, that has already been with lofty expectations will not derail a long-term investment theme that we all know is here to stay. The technology advance that we will be seeing on the back, of these type of chips implemented is just, a long-term driver for growth. And so we will not abandon that view we've been holding for years, actually, so far in the future, because right now expectations gone too far.
So would a dip be a buying opportunity?
Yes, yes.
That's a strong yes.
Yes.
In terms of how Nvidia has driven animal spirits in the market, that correlation, is that likely to continue, and for how long?
Well, so without talking about a specific stock, which obviously, sometimes we have seen that condensation of 7 stocks actually leading the market higher. I think we've already seen that this has been spreading out. So that gives us also more confidence that this is not just about AI. And I read in some of the subtitles it's already marked as an AI hype, which I think is now a little bit negative to draw back that there was a hype that is now coming to a standstill. We see the rally already broadening out. So we have been advocating to our clients a long time ago that it's appropriate to have a barbell, but the small caps and large caps, keep on to those, but not just rely on one.
Stefanie, hang tight. Let's do a check-in on how Indian markets are doing in the pre-market session. Of course, this is on the back of Adani's indictment. Let's take a look at how it's shaping up for the Nifty futures, currently in negative territory, down about 0.7%. We have, of course, the Nifty futures underperforming the rest of the region, which is also in negative territory, but much weaker than that. Adani Enterprises in excess of 10%. Of course, Adani Green, which is a key part of that indictment, currently lower by 17% as we speak. So it does look like Adani shares are under a lot of pressure as we count down to that open at 11:45 local time, which is in about 7 minutes from here. Of course, we've been talking about how Adani dollar bonds tumbling as much as 10 cents earlier. Adani Green Energy dollar note sold in March fell by a record, and we're seeing a similar reaction when it comes to what is anticipated in terms of Adani stocks. Massive loss right there on the back of that indictment on Gautam Adani, as well as perhaps half a dozen executives. Let's get back to Stefanie Holtze-Jen, Apex CIO at Deutsche Bank Private Bank. How are you positioning under such an environment in the markets today? We have Trump, of course, on the cusp of a presidency, expected to perhaps, adopt inflationary policies. How are you positioning for all of that?
So in terms of the global view, we still hold on to a constructive outperformance of U.S. equities. We look at this part of the world, Asia, obviously having to deal with a few headwinds that are coming our way around securities, around tariffs, of course, and also the wiggle room that we will be seeing that is getting less now for local central banks to also start cutting rates because or do more of the rate cuts. And we have seen Bank Indonesia, for instance, holding yesterday because the higher for longer environment, the exceptionalism for the US dollar, the attractiveness of US assets, may that be equities or from an interest rate perspective, will be weighing on this part of the world. So having said that, though, the growth is still very remarkably. Asia has been contributing 60% of world growth this year and will be able to continue to do so, even with less of a stimulus. So it is a cautiously optimistic view into this region, which will still see in our forecast a high single-digit number outperformance for the Asia ex-Japan complex into next year.
Now, when you talk about Asia ex-Japan, China is front and center.
Absolutely.
People say that stimulus measures have put a floor to Chinese stocks. Is that an argument that you buy as well?
That is my argument, actually. So you've heard me saying here many times that I hold on to a medium and long-term constructive view. I felt that view was confirmed when we also saw the market finally reacting. But it's been a reaction that came on the heels of the monetary policy stimulus. But I think the market is mistaking the China story right now for just focusing on some of the smaller measures. I would want to look at it in its entirety because we've really seen the three arrows of Xenomics. We started with the structural reform package during the third plenum. It was followed up when the wind was blowing in their sails with 50 basis points of Fed cut, then with the very sizable monetary policy stimulus package, especially the stock stabilization part, which has then led to the rally. And it was just met with what the market was also demanding, the fiscal stimulus package a couple of weeks ago. So this is a very meaningful undertaking. It's methodical and it is very timely as well. It's obviously geared towards also the feedback loop because the stimulus package came after we had the US election result, after we saw that what the Fed would be doing. So I think it's a very smart way of engineering your own recovery story right now. And just two more things I want to mention, because what I think we haven't seen as much in the past has been forward guidance we're getting from the central bank right now that they are prepared to do more. And also we're getting quite a good feedback loop with the market conversation because they do not want to underdeliver or overpromise. And that conversation is quite strong right now to make sure the market is stabilizing and putting a floor in.
Stefanie, we're counting down to the India Open, and already we're seeing massive drops for Adani shares on the back of that indictment. I mean, how are you looking at the Indian market on the back of that?
So it has been expected now, given that the news has been front and center today. I think it's also dented sentiment overall in the region already. Now, India has already been in a negative spotlight because it had been struggling with outflows over the last weeks and months because of a combination of the repricing on a stronger dollar, but also a lot of talks around the higher valuations coming in. And then, of course, when China picked up, the rotation came actually out of India, not so much out of Japan. So all of that is now just being met with one additional negative news. So I think in the short term, we will have to weather that volatility and look at it from an opportunistic point of view to look at most probably coming in at better levels.
Of course, this is not a new crisis for the Adani Group. I mean, we had the Hindenburg report, which wiped out $150 billion of value at one time. It managed to recover from that. I mean, if you take that into perspective, would a drop in Adani shares be potentially a buying opportunity as well?
So again, I look at it from a more medium and long-term perspective on the wider market as a CIO, and hence the overall story in terms of the infrastructure build in India, the opportunity that comes with the local consumer, all the investments that have been done, and the taxation arrangements around manufacturing, etc. All of this is working for the India story. So a drop in the market will present a medium and long-term buying opportunity to stay invested or get in at better levels.
Of course, we've been talking about how funds have been flowing from India to China. Might that persist given the optimism that, the stimulus measures will be impactful, or will that money come from somewhere else instead of just flowing from India to China?
Yeah, I think there's a timing issue here because right now the Chinese market is building a floor, but it's not attracting any more rotation flow since we have seen the initial step up in equities. And I think that is because the fiscal stimulus measures have been in some part disappointing because they're only focused on one part. So we will have, which is local government, so we will have to wait for the December Economic Work Conference, which is typically at the beginning of December, to see what is there to be followed up. And then, of course, there's this monitoring of activity data, which I think is a little bit early to now scrutinize every single data point that is current or backward looking to draw a conclusion whether the three arrows of Genomics have already worked. So we will have to give it more time, and at that point I think we will be having to look at rotation flows again.
Stefanie, we're just moments away from the Indian Open. Of course, Adani shares falling pre-market on the back of the charges imposed on him, and several executives at the Adani Group, the Sensex index, in negative territory as expected on the back of that news. Let's take a look at how Adani shares in particular are performing. Those losses continuing. Adani Enterprises currently down in excess of 10%. Adani Green in particular getting smacked right there. Those stocks down by almost 17%. Adani Power, Adani Total Gas also not being spared, of course, on the back of U.S. prosecutors charging Gautam Adani with participating in a bribery scheme, promising to pay more than $250 million to Indian government officials, and that's to secure solar energy contracts. All the other Adani stocks are also getting impacted in tandem. Adani Ports, as well as Ambuja Cement, Adani Wilmar, New Delhi Televisions, all getting impacted by the news, and not surprising that we've been seeing massive reaction in the first few minutes of trade right here. Of course, earlier we saw how Adani dollar bonds tumbling as much as 10 cents. Adani Green Energy dollar notes sold in March fell by a record. So a stunning downturn for the Adani shares as we speak right now. Stefanie, this is not surprising, right? The reaction in the market.
No, it is not.
Where do you go from here, do you think? I mean, we saw how it took quite a long time for Adani shares to actually recover. Might they take the same path from here?
Then again, I am not commenting on a specific share, but I look at it from a wider market perspective, and the India opportunity is more than just one share. So once the dust is settling, once all the news have been digested, and again, it's been impacting the overall market, not just the Indian here in Asia this morning. So we'll have to see where the bottom builds, and then look at it with a bigger macro lens again.
How about the rest of emerging Asia? We talk constantly about U.S. exceptionalism. That will come at the expense of emerging markets, especially the ones in this part of the world.
Exactly. I think we already feel that there's a change of central bank reaction function happening, which in the beginning, when we had the Fed starting with a 50 basis point cut, you've seen a lot of local central banks like the Philippines, South Korea, then Indonesia, for instance, reacting right away, being able to put monetary policy stimulus into play as well. Because at this moment in time, you didn't have to have this balancing act to do again, where if you take your rates down earlier than the Fed, you would risk even more currency pressure. Now we had the repricing, and it's that old narrative again that we had before the Fed rate cuts, where you have a U.S. exceptionalism and the U.S. dollar, the higher for longer narrative in the U.S. is putting pressure on this. So again, it will diminish the opportunity for central banks in the region to put more monetary policy stimulus in, which for some of the countries would have been a good one because we're seeing slowing growth. But then again, we're talking about growth that comes, from a 5, 6, and 7% handle, and it will not derail the opportunities that come on the back of if a China story, for instance, is stabilizing. Also on the back of China, the China +1 diversification into Southeast Asia is continuing. So overall, this is still a region to be positive on in terms of investment gains.
But still a lack of clarity in terms of challenges, what Trump's policies might mean for the rest of the world, especially this part of the world. I mean, how do you manage those risks? How do you counter the risk? How do you hedge?
So there's a lot of good hedges one can put in the portfolio that one should have actually in the portfolio. portfolio
Gold
even
seems
before.
to be one.
Exactly. So I was coming long-winded to the gold opportunity, which I think is still very strong, especially in an environment where you have your local currency, for instance, being under pressure, because I think from a Chinese retail investor perspective, they have been driving gold to a large part this year already. So now we're back into the old narrative that I explained, where you may meet higher tariffs with the depreciation in your currency, because that's the immediate way to being able to offset some of that uncompetitiveness that you face. Then, of course, property market right now still provides negative carry and doesn't give you that store of value. The go-to is again gold. So gold will remain in our portfolios, and will have a sizable upside going forward. So has the US dollar.
I'm just wondering what your views are on Bitcoin. It's surged past 90,000, and people say at some point when institutional investors get into digital assets, we could see a further upside. I mean, how are you looking at that?
So in terms of digitalized currency exposures and how these have been behaving because of the speculation around a Trump administration putting out that they put some of this in the reserve, we see this as a speculation. Yes, you bring it up obviously in the context of gold. Some investors seem to wanting to draw the same line in regards to providing a safe haven. I do not see the correlation, to be honest. So gold is a much better investment. There's a physical backing. There's the ability to see what the supply and demand is. And so from that perspective, it will still remain the better investment.
Just one final question before we let you go. What's your conviction trade for 2025? If it's just one.
But there's more than one. We already talked about a few. So gold is definitely one. The U.S. equity story remains. We haven't talked about bonds, but this environment, we're still investing and keep on the high quality part of the bonds side, investment grade. I just explained that most probably China is again a view that I have to explain more around, because there's still not the same buy-in. So there's a lot of conviction around all these.
All right, Stefanie, thank you so much for that. Stefanie Holtze-Jen of Deutsche Bank Private Bank. We're tracking, of course, Adani shares on the back of that indictment on Gautam Adani and half a dozen officials. Those shares under negative territory at this point in time. Sensex being dragged down by that, down by 0.5%. Nifty Bank Index also in negative territory. Those Adani shares, Adani Group shares, are getting smacked as we speak. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Well, we continue to track Adani stocks as India is trading at this point in time. Adani shares slumping as we speak on the back of the U.S. charges. U.S. prosecutors charging Gautam Adani with participating in a bribery scheme promising to pay more than $250 million to Indian government officials to secure solar energy contract. We're seeing Adani shares getting smacked right there. Adani Enterprises down by more than 10%. Adani Power, Adani Green, that's the one unit involved in particular slumping about 17%. We're also keeping an eye on GQG Partners, which as of the quarter that ended on September 30th held 6 Adani Group companies, which range between 1.5% to 2%. That is it for Insight. Horizons Middle East and Africa is next. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.